Charles de Wet is an executive at ENS in the tax practice. Charles, good evening. Thanks for talking to us again so soon. Would the VAT hike of 2% really made up the shortfall, especially when you take into effect, and I imagine it's hard to sort of game this out, but especially when you take into effect more goods being zero rated for VAT and higher social grants?
I think it would have had quite a big impact, Stephen. By our calculations, a 1% increase would have been about 30 billion rand. I don't think a 2% makes that 60 billion rand. I mean, what concerns me about it is, if they were looking for 60 billion or even 50 billion, that's a really big number. I think when we started early in the week, we said, maybe 25 to 30 billion in the medium-term budget framework. They said they needed another 22. We thought they could be another 10 down, but it looks at, as if it could be 20 billion on top of that. So that is a big number. I think from a balancing perspective, by zero rating some of the products, that would have eaten into that slightly. The grants would have impacted it, and it sounds like the the public sector wage bill also impacted on it. But it sounds as if we are in a more desperate place than anybody thought we were, and there are going to have to be some tax increases on the 12th of March, or alternatively, we're going to have to increase borrowing that has got its own implications.
I mean, now you have at least one political party in the coalition that has claimed victory. They can't give in easily now, which would suggest to me that a 2 percentage point VAT increase is now off the table. In other words, that's the new reality. Politically, it's impossible.
I would agree with that. Whether that takes us back to 1% or zero, I think, so whether we stick to 15 is going to be the big question. I think realistically, if and on the basis that all the other options have been considered, in terms of an increase in personal personal rates, they're going to have to find the funding somewhere, and that is the best place to do it. So everything will have to be carved back, and they'll have to deal with the 28 to 30 billion as opposed to the 45 to 50 billion of additional income, and cut the slices smaller on the expenditure side.
So, on expenditure, and plenty of people are going to stand up on any podium and into any microphone they can find over the next few days, and they're going to say government should cut back, and they're going to point to, depending, name your pick your politician and I'll name you one. But some of them will say it'll be government workers. Some of them will say it'll be government perks. At some point, someone will mention the VIP protection unit. We all know what's going to happen. But isn't it practically actually very difficult to cut back in a big way? And because at some point you are going to cut back the meat of services, the muscle of services, and that is a very difficult thing to do. And we've already seen that in health and education over the last couple of years in some ways.
It comes back to the fundamental problem, and and this is sort of the concerning thing in terms of what they're going to do with the additional 2%. What we need is economic growth, because if we could get economic growth, then we get tax collections up, because the economy generates that in the circumstances, and we create employment. So we're not cutting funding, but we in fact creating opportunities and generating more revenue, and that's what we should be looking to do. If it went into that, if it went into growing to the economy, that we could get economic growth, far up above 1%, then our problems are solved. But obviously, that's more of a longer term solution and not something that can be done overnight.
And of course, just a reminder that increasing VAT hinders economic growth.
Exactly. So, the impact is there's less money to go around. Households are already under significant pressure, even if they do increase the zero-rated products in the circumstances. So we go through it a little bit of a decline before we actually get onto the positive path again. So that's very negative, and it takes longer to get us where we want to go.
Charles de Wet, thank you so much. Executive at ENS in the tax practice. You with the Money Show, 10 minutes to 7. Mervyn Abrahams is the program coordinator at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Project. You'll know, of course, they monitor food prices. They work with people in this space, and they work work with people who are often just very much getting by every month. Mervyn, good evening to you. You'll know, of course, now we're going to have a big national debate on the impact of VAT. A 2 percentage point increase in VAT. I presume this would have a huge impact on millions of people who are just finding enough money every month.
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to all your listeners. Exactly. I fully agree with you, Stephen. Currently, in terms of the basket of food that we track 44 very basic foods. 22 of those foods are zero rated. So the 22 foods on which consumers pay VAT, in the month of January, that cost came to 331 Rand. So that's already in the VAT basket, or at least on our basket. 22% would significantly increase that amount. And it would mean in many cases that people will just have to buy less food in order to pay this higher level of VAT.
In the speech that was, I suppose, first leaked, but now all the embargoes have been lifted in the last few moments by the National Treasury, it did look like more items were going to be zero rated for VAT. Some meat, some milk products, things like that. I mean, does that have a big impact? And I absolutely understand the logic behind it, that there are certain things that should be as cheap as possible and therefore you shouldn't pay any tax on them. But do they actually make much of a difference? And I suppose it would depend how big you make that basket of zero-rated goods.
Exactly, Stephen. So once you start there and you increase, then you have to keep on increasing. And then the question is, well, what's the point of increasing value-added tax? Because then you end up zero-rating so many of the goods that you wish to tax. So I mean, we would have to see exactly what it is that Treasury has in mind in terms of what they would like to zero rate. But Stephen, then there's also the question around administered prices. So, for instance, will there be consideration around zero rating electricity, for instance, charged by municipalities, which includes VAT, on the poorest? Various municipal services, etc. And when you start going into that debate, actually the amount of revenue that will be raised by Treasury will actually get less and less. And then the question is really, was this the best instrument in order to raise the extra revenue that is needed?
Obviously, we need extra revenue. I mean, I've asked so many people this over the last few days. What other options are there?
So, yes, and I think that's going to be the million-dollar question. But I think what this will do, now that the budget has been withdrawn, there's a whole debate around value-added tax. Now the debate in the country will be around where else do we go. And it might be that for the first time we might be able to have a proper, rational debate around a wealth tax, what that means, who that will target, what percentages are we talking about. We might have a proper debate around who else do we draw in. For instance, the Development Bank of South Africa. How can some of that resources be utilized in terms of our infrastructure build? Where in government do we need to cut back on? And we are not suggesting they cut back on nurses and doctors and teachers. But do we require as many politicians as we have in the country at the moment? So for us, this is actually a good, what has happened in a bad way could very well have a good result, in the sense that it now becomes a public debate before the next budget is presented.
So I appreciate and accept and enjoy your sentiment about the debate that we'll have. My concern is that the people who are going to make the decisions about the budget have not changed. It is the same people. And we may well, and we'll probably end up hosting, and I look forward to it, hosting part of that debate here. You know, this will be something that the Money Show will debate for some time, and so we should. I just think that the same people are going to come to the same conclusions because there's a sort of almost a political lock on things, unfortunately. And in fact, strangely, the only reason that we won't get the 2% hike now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, is that now the DA has sort of said on this is the hill on which we will fight. And so that's the only reason it won't happen. Let me put this another way, Mervyn. I'm not convinced our political order as it currently is, and this is not about one party, it's about all of them. I'm not convinced our current political order is actually able to make changes to the system which got that order there in the first place.
Stephen, I fully understand what you're saying, and I hope, I really do hope that there is now a kind of a rationality that enters into the political space. But I'm just thinking back to 2018 when VAT was increased by 1%. And there was massive debate within the Finance Select Committee of Parliament, and evidence were being presented and alternatives were brought. And in the final analysis, the answer that came back was that the minister had tabled the budget. And because the minister had already tabled the budget, the ANC was in no position to change it because he would have to withdraw the entire budget. In this particular instance, we have a different situation in that the budget has not been tabled. And we now know with the embargoes being lifted, all the good things that this budget was talking about, as well as the VAT increase. So I think that there is the possibility of public debate swaying the political people at the moment. And of course, the GNU. I think this was a good expression of the GNU, where different political parties can hold each other accountable on some matters.
Mervyn Abrahams, thank you very much indeed. Program Coordinator at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Project.